IEEE, in ICANN, and ITU. These are a lot of acronyms, but you'll recognize them as like the standards development organizations that make a lot of really important decisions. We just felt that it's important for human rights NGOs to be involved in those spaces, especially when we can leverage technical expertise in our organizations, which we did. And that's kind of what I'm here to talk about.
Thank you so much. Could you tell us a little bit more about your prior affiliations before this?
Yeah, so before CDT and Article 19, I also worked at the Association for Progressive Communications. It's a mouthful. It was founded in 1990, and I worked there for about 6 years. That was a really incredible experience because it's a network organization. So it's about, I don't know, at this point, maybe 70 or 80 nonprofit organizations around the world. And most of them are based in Africa, Latin America, Asia, and a few like in Europe and North America. But they all have one thing in common, which is that they work in this space, digital human rights or social justice in tech, that sort of thing. And I was the technical specialist there. So I just really learned a lot from working on these same issues, but from the perspective of the Global South, because a lot of what we're seeing now in 2020 were already problems many years ago for other countries and other regimes where governments aren't super democratic, where the infrastructure isn't really strong, and where there's other issues. So I learned a great deal from that, and it's been extremely formative in my career.
That's awesome. So just diving right in, I think I first want to ask you, what exactly is a public interest technologist? And what kinds of things would you do in your day-to-day job?
Yeah, that's why we're here. I want to talk about that at length. So public interest technology is pretty wide. It's a field. It's not just one thing. I want to quote or paraphrase rather something that Bruce Schneier wrote about it. He said, public interest technologists are people who combine their technical expertise with a public interest focus, either by working on tech policy or working on a tech project that has a public benefit, or working as a more traditional technologist, but for an organization that then has a public interest focus. And I think the last one was sort of what I saw or imagined my career path to be when I started down this road over a decade ago. I imagined that I would work for a nonprofit organization, the mission of which I believed very strongly in, but that I would be maybe a systems administrator or a webmaster or the IT specialist. But it wasn't until a few years after I started doing that I realized, wow, there's actually a lot of really crucial programmatic work that these organizations need to do that requires technical expertise beyond just, making a campaign website or an app, right? And so that's sort of where things evolve for me. And I know that also is the case for a lot of other public interest technologists that I knew at the time and worked with around like the mid to late 2000s. I would say that, but CDT is actually one of the organizations that's been ahead of the curve, along with Stanford University, where in the early 2000s, like really like 2000, 2001, they sort of imagined applying the field of public interest lawyering to the specialty of technology. So, in the 70s or around that point, there was a push to get lawyers to not just work for corporations, but hey, can you apply, your legal skills to the civil sector to help either individuals in court, to advocate in policymaking on behalf of the public interest. So there's this big push. And so, 20 years ago, people started thinking about like, okay, so how can we take technologists and entice them to do essentially the same thing? So CDT hired its first CTO in 2001. And it was sort of, it's incredibly interdisciplinary and cross-disciplinary work. And it still remains so today. So even though it's 20 years later, I would say that there's not a terribly firm community of practice around public interest technology, and we're still doing field building. So we're still working with everybody from funders like, the Ford Foundation or MacArthur Foundation that understand it and actively want more public interest technologists in the civil society organizations, to the civil society organizations themselves, right? So to convince, the sort of larger NGOs and so on that they actually need to cultivate and grow their technical expertise so that they can more effectively advocate to companies and to governments and anywhere else they're working on when there's a digital related issue that they've faced. So if you're a public interest technologist, you could be an activist, you could be a coder, you could be an artist, you could be an educator or a civil servant. You can research, you might be an advisor. There's a whole lot of different roles that you have. The things that are sort of in common between everyone is, again, like what Bruce Schneier said around the focus and the intent of the work and how you apply your expertise. There was actually Ford Foundation had commissioned a report on this not terribly long ago. I'm looking at one from 2016. I can tweet it out later, but if you also look for, the title is A Pivotal Moment, Developing a New Generation of Technologists for the Public Interest. They identified 4 basic archetypes of a public interest technologist after interviewing loads of different people and looking at lots of literature. So the first one is maybe you're a computer scientist or a designer or an engineer, or maybe even a data scientist. So that's very clear, like technical expertise. The second bucket is more around public interest leaders or even like technology leaders. Like I'm sure we're aware that the folks who sometimes lead companies or technology institutions are not always technical, but they are leaders and they understand technology from a higher level. Another archetype of public interest technologists might be people who are really influential in policy or field experts. So again, like, if you've got a program on student privacy, for example, maybe you're an expert in education and the technical knowledge you have is situational and you're able to be a public interest technologist in that specific field. And then the last bucket of archetype, or the last archetype of a public interest technologist would be either an activist or an advocate. So folks that are just, in the field, in their work to advocate and be activists, and that they've had to pick up issues around technology on their way because the times have changed and now everything has a sort of internet and digital component to it.
Yeah, I think that's really interesting that you say that because, a lot of us here are very interested after we graduate college to go into, I guess, big tech or work in a corporate environment. But then there are a lot of people who also want to do like nonprofit social justice type work that you kind of do. And I think this coincides a little bit with one of the questions we have. But like, could you tell us more about how you got to become a public interest technologist? And I think people also want to hear what kind of technical and non-technical backgrounds do you think prepares an individual for impactful work? I know you had kind of a non-traditional journey into tech, but yeah, if you could tell us a little bit about that.
Yeah, for sure. So I don't have what I think would be a typical trajectory, but I would say that's true for a lot of my peers. Again, like, I mean, I'm thinking of people who've maybe been in this field for about 10 years. So things might be different now. I mean, it always changes, right? But yeah, I'm happy to talk about that. So I do have a technical background in STEM anyway. So I have a physics degree and I also ended up with a double major in math at the same time. I did research as an undergrad in high energy physics. And so a lot of it was sometimes computational. Like we just had a lot of data. We had to do stuff with it. So I think I took one computer science class as an undergrad and then just taught myself everything else. I actually ended up having to teach myself Fortran because I had an advisor who insisted that it was the best programming language. This was before the days of like Stack Overflow. So I had to actually check a book out of the library that was all about punch cards. But anyway, I'm getting sidetracked. So that was sort of my experience. as an undergrad, I was always an activist while I was in university. In fact, I sort of helped pay my way through school by working part-time, as many of us do. I worked in homeless shelters. I worked in 2 different ones as an undergrad. So I just always had, side activism in addition to things that made me really excited, like high energy physics and things. And so as I continued my work both as an activist, and as then it turned out I went into teaching high school physics after university. The 2 sort of started to dovetail a bit, and I was really happy about that, but it wasn't something I expected. I just sort of always was comfortable with having more than one thing going on. And my activism was my hobby. It was often where I had my friend groups. And I didn't expect necessarily that they would converge, although teaching public school felt like a way in which, working in as sort of a public servant of sorts in, science and technology sort of came together. I taught in New York City public schools, physics, and I also then worked part-time, as I have explained, at a bookstore. So, and actually you should check out this bookstore, because they, as many sort of brick and mortar institutions right now, are a bit struggling during the pandemic, and they have a fundraiser because they've just moved locations on the Lower East Side of New York. They're called Blue Stockings. So Blue Stockings NYC, you can look them up. But so I obviously then ran into a lot of activism and a lot of really amazing campaigns and projects there. One of the places just around the corner on the Lower East Side is a squat and a art space, event space called ABC No Rio. And so every Sunday they had a computer lab. Every Sunday I would go and hang out with a few other techies, and we would, if there was nobody in the computer lab who needed training, we would train each other. And mostly, I mean, me, the guys that were there they would help me learn, stuff. And that's, I have to give them a lot of credit. In fact, some of those guys that were there with me then, we all kind of have public interest technology jobs at the ACLU, at New America. It's kind of awesome to see us going from kind of young hackery, hobby types to actually doing this for a living. So yeah, I worked in that community. I then slowly started applying my computer skills more and more. I'm going to talk a little bit later about somebody that I met at that time, but in 2005, 2006, a lot of NGOs or small campaigns, they weren't using the internet really for their work yet. It wasn't core to what they were doing, but more were starting to get interested in that. So I was around at the time when a lot of small grassroots groups just needed their first website. A few years later, it turned into needing to understand and integrate social media into what they were doing. So I just sort of was, around grassroots movements through being able to provide the technical expertise so that they had a platform basically on the internet. And yeah, I think that's really, how I got involved. And like I said, it went from working as a freelancer essentially for a long time to landing a job with the Association for Progressive Communications that was we've been doing this since 1990. We don't want you to come fix our website, which I did do. But I also at the same time was hired to actually be part of the programming, because all of their programming as a human rights organization, as a social justice organization was focused on things like internet access, violence against women online, the digital divide, these kinds of things that we talk about freely now. But at the time, we're actually APC and only a handful of other organizations were even doing that. So that was pretty great. And that sort of launched me into the policy work that I do now.
That's awesome. I think everybody's kind of interested to know now. So we've heard a little bit about where you came from and how you got into this area. Could you talk a little bit about your work at the CDT, and have you seen any real effects come from your work? Because I know you do interact with a lot of like big tech companies. You are able to have a lot of influence through this organization, and even within the government. So maybe if you could talk a little bit about that, that would be great.
Sure. So I would say that my work at CDT, even though I've been here for 6 months, I will say that it's like pandemic 6 months. So it feels like I haven't been here that long, and I'm still learning a lot. I've been out of I'm originally from the United States, but I haven't lived here for about 10 years. So I'm also getting used to being in DC and working for a policy organization on the Hill. I would say, though, that as the chief technologist, I don't have to worry about that. I'm around incredibly smart lawyers who have been exposed to some extremely sharp technologists in the past. I'm replacing some like amazing people that came before me. And so everyone at CDT is a public interest technologist. So I think that my day-to-day it's a mix. One of the great things about the way CDT operates is it's very agile and responsive, because it needs to be able to respond to what's happening today and not too focused on, the deliverables that we have coming down the pike in the future. So I really appreciate that. So it means that when I wake up in the morning, I check out my calendar to see who I've committed to meeting with. And then often I just do a lot of reading and a lot of not always just reviews or documents or books, although there's plenty of that. But sometimes it's just about being responsive to mailing lists, especially because I have within my remit work in international standards bodies. So there's a lot of reading and responding on those lists that are built around if it's the W3C or the IATF and so on. But it varies, it varies. I think in previous positions, again, pre-COVID and, before March, there was a lot of international travel as well. So a lot of the ways in which the internet must be governed is international. And we're sort of understanding and doing a really great job, I think, of doing this without traveling and being face-to-face. But that global element is critical. And we can't underestimate how much cross-border and cross-continental collaboration is required to keep the internet going. And so I'm really appreciative now of not having to travel, because that's a lot of time spent and carbon spent on airplanes. So I can focus that better into, reading time. But, that's part of being an expert, just like lots of reading and digesting and responding.
Mm-hmm. Thank you so much. So I think something that's been very prevalent in our society, especially now and within tech companies, they're paying a lot of attention to it now, is the ongoing civil rights movement, like relating to BLM, and other social justice efforts in general too. I kind of want to get your perspective on how students like us can get involved in this or make an impact even in our area, or turn this into a career almost, being able to fight for these causes. And yeah.
So this is my favorite question. I'm really excited to answer it. I was so excited about it that I actually asked some of my prior colleagues and other people that I really respect. So you won't just hear my opinion on it, because I felt it was important for me to, talk to civil rights leaders directly about it. So one that I asked is Brandy Collins. Brandy Collins was at the Center for Media Justice and Color for Change, two absolutely critical organizations that are working on Black Lives Matter, that are working on technology issues that affect directly African Americans in the United States. So if you're not following them or reading about their work, you should just stop everything and read that. So Brandy, when I asked her, what would you say to people participating in this conference, she wrote back, and I'm just going to read it verbatim. She said, "There's no question computer science and technology skills are needed in any number of places. There's a lot of organizations like Color of Change that are often looking for people to help build internal infrastructure and systems to increase the security, safety, and accuracy in service of racial or other forms of justice. But there's also an emerging network of organizations like the Algorithmic Justice League and innovative think tanks within universities that are prioritizing addressing these issues like algorithmic bias, machine learning, ethical, digital media ethics, and informatics." So I think that she's really speaking to that there's both, right? You can lift up and help these organizations operate, which is an absolutely critical and necessary thing. But you can also help direct some of the higher level issues that we're trying to address with the sort of emerging and technology and present day issues. I would just say, I'll read the last thing she wrote, which is, finally, you can go be the subversive force in a number of fields, industries, and companies and public entities that are building unethical models and surveillance systems that are reinforcing biases. So there's another role too, which is that you don't have to be afraid of working for companies that you might even object to, because there are ways that you can be the person who listens to civil society organizations as an advocate that does talk to companies. That's really important, to have an ally on the inside who will actually reach out with a phone call, or when we do level criticism, to receive it and try to do something with it. And then, yeah, there's all kinds of decisions from the micro to the macro within these companies that actually can make huge impact. I had another one, if you don't mind. Can I read it?
Yeah, definitely. Go ahead.
Okay. I think we're doing good on time. So this one is one of my favorites, and I did foreshadow this conversation. So this comes from Rollo, who is a queer activist in San Francisco that I met in 2006 when we worked on a campaign together in New York to free a group of lesbians called the New Jersey Four. So the reason why this is significant is because 2006 seems like a very long time ago. And it was one of the first times that I can remember making a website and doing things on the internet for like a social justice cause, which I'd been doing for years. So it was really significant. So I reached out to Rollo and I was like, hey, I have the opportunity to speak to a bunch of computer science students about how to do their thing in the service of public interest and civil rights. What would you tell them? And so she says, I tell them to quit. And I said, I thought you'd say something like that, having obviously known this person for a long time. And then she says, the tech industry is doing massive damage to the concept of work, from the gig economy to stock options. Class aspirant entrepreneurial strivers become cogs in the furtherance of a total surveillance state, and class consciousness is impossible. Again, lives in San Francisco. So I'm trying to, soften it and trying to find something. So I say, well, maybe they need to join up with groups to fight that. And she says, after a long pause, big tech is the death knell for collective bargaining. I say, you're right, we should be doing more. I genuinely believe that we should be doing more. And I, as a longtime activist, feel compelled to always be pushed to do more. She continued, tech and surveillance and the police have a cyclical, nightmarish relationship. And so I said, okay, if you think of anything else, let me know. I have a few weeks until my talk. And she's like, yeah, quit is the most I can come up with. So, I mean, I think you should do whatever you want. And I don't want to quit, but I did want to genuinely pass that on, because I feel that there are some folks who have dedicated their lives to, LGBT causes, or Black Lives Matter, or, immigration and migration, and think about the ways in which digital authoritarianism has affected different communities in the Middle East and so on, that just feel that there's nothing to be saved, that tech is not the answer, and that if anything, the most radical thing we can do is just to, actively fight against it. So I just wanted to present that as one of the possibilities when you start talking to folks who are really invested in systemic change, how they may react. And sometimes, yeah, I mean, from my own analysis, that you might just have to sometimes get out of the way or use your platform to lift others up. But that's sometimes what needs to happen.
Mm-hmm. Definitely. And like you mentioned, staying educated, which I think is like incredibly important, especially within our industry. Staying educated on like what the government is doing related to tech. I think that's also very important. Like, what kinds of things do you recommend people should read to do this? You mentioned that you do a lot of reading in your personal job too. So
I do a lot of reading. I have so many open tabs. It would be a scandal to tell you how many. I think it's that I do a lot of reviews. So I'm, if I'm doing a review for a technical specification, I often then need to read references, and maybe I'm unfamiliar. So then I'm reading like the source material and so on. So that can take a long time. So I feel like, that's a sort of need to know. There's nothing I can tell you around that specific thing, but I do really think that it's important to read reports. I think we're all sort of, me included at times, we're on social media and we see, oh, great, like Human Rights Watch put out this incredible report about, whatever topic, and we tweet it or we share it, but we don't read it. And I think it's important to read it. I think it's important to digest what civil society research is putting out, and follow the footnotes sometimes, because it'll take you back, right? Some of these conversations have been ongoing for a while. And it's okay also to read something that was published 10 years ago. It doesn't just have to be current stuff. So definitely do your homework. I think we all need to take that lesson. It just takes a lot of work to be an expert. You just got to read a lot. That's just the end of it. Sometimes you can, like, there are different strategies for dealing with that. If you digest things better audially, then you need to maybe listen to more podcasts, or you can use different kinds of readers. But yeah, I think in terms of where to look, I also think you're all so incredibly lucky. I wish I had an academic affiliation so that I had access to all the journals that I could get my hands on. So take advantage of that. And, like I said, follow the footnotes. It's really like the best way to get excited about something is you've already found a report that you find terribly interesting. Geek out and read all the footnotes, like from one nerd to another. That's my advice.
Sorry, I was muted. For students who decide to go into like the corporate world, what recommendations do you have for them, as to how they can do social justice work while also being in tech, or making an impact from within the companies?
Yeah, that's a really good question. And I like this question because I think that we all have a role to play in a variety of sectors. I would also say that there's a great deal that one can do in government now. I'll get to the companies in a second, but I wanted to dwell on government because I think more and more we're seeing roles for technical experts in government. And there's still field building going on. So in the same way that, civil society and the public sector are taking this on, that's also true for government. In companies, it's a sort of foregone conclusion, right? That companies are going to have technical experts. I think it's the technical expert who can be a bridge to other sectors. So first, you have to be a good listener and a good reader, and to understand things that are outside a technical and engineering realm. So that's step one, but also to care about it, right? Because you can read all you want, but if you don't care about it, then you're not going to digest it and take it on. And then I think being able to communicate well and explain technical concepts in a direct and not necessarily simple, but complicated things in a way that people can understand, and being patient with it and explaining it multiple times. Like, those are really critical skills. And you can't engage in dialogue if people can't understand each other. So if you want to be working with communities or civil rights leaders or whatever it is, you better be able to have a back and forth conversation, because it's not a one-way exchange. And that bridge role, then I think gets stronger and stronger as you're able to dialogue more. So that's critical. And I'm constantly looking for ways in which I can dialogue more. It's actually kind of, I feel like I'm in a bit of a bubble these last few years, having worked so much in technical standards, that I haven't cultivated enough some of the relationships and work that I've built previously with social movements and activists. And it feels like there's not much of a dialogue right now. And I really miss that. And I feel like it's just important to have. And so that just thinking of yourself, if your focus is on whatever it's on, you can always bring that sort of critical commitment to dialogue and communication with you when you need to reach out to a civil society organization to get their opinion on something, or to engage them in a co-design project or in user feedback, or whatever it is that you might be conducting within the company. And then just be that person who advocates internally. That is so key. So there's loads of stuff that we can do externally, right? To ask companies, pretty please care about this issue related to discrimination, or please, 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 we have evidence that this is a problem on your platform. But it's not until you have people on the inside who actually start talking about that within the internal company, across the organization, across the company, that a lot of these things get taken up. So be that person. That'd be really helpful.
Yeah, and I know you have personally been able to, like you were telling me the other day, that you've been able to talk to large corporations and um, people have been hearing you out. So I was wondering, do you have any, I don't know, anecdotes about this in which you saw like actual change come from these sorts of things? It might be inspiring to other young engineers here.
I think it's always a mixed bag. Sometimes there's a lot of alignment. So there may be things around privacy, or like end-to-end encryption, for example, which is on everybody's on everybody's Twitter feed these days, or things like that, where there's natural alignment between civil society and companies. So it's not like it's a hard sell. It's like, let's work together on this and talk through what's important. And maybe the adversary is like, law enforcement or government or something. Other times, I think it's about being able to, again, like be a bridge, and say, look, I understand why your platform is the way it is, but this isn't what users expect, right? Like I can just give one example of talking through the ways in which the contact tracing apps for COVID-19 would work. And so people, like companies, were concerned that about privacy, about user privacy when you're disclosing this kind of information. So they come to an organization like CDT and they'll be like, can you just review our scheme and give us feedback on it so that we know that, a privacy advocacy organization like CDT is going to be happy with it when we release it and talk about it. Sometimes you just have to be like, this, if users find out this is how it works, they're going to be unhappy, or they're different. I think they're just different ways of saying things, right? And it just really depends on the context in which you've been asked, or which we've been asked, or in which we're put together with companies to talk about it. I would say that more often than not, there is alignment, actually. It's just maybe sometimes in the most difficult times, it's just hard to find, but there's always some kind of alignment. I think people, no matter what sector they work for, are really just trying to do the right thing. And let's just figure out what that right thing is together. It's rare that I find it's just, well, let's just agree to disagree and like we're done. But then again, we can't really debate what my friend Rala was saying, which is that you just shouldn't exist. Often we're not having that conversation, but we're having sort of a more nuanced, detailed conversation. But anyway, I think there are some questions that I'm keen to get to, but there have been so many, so I'll have to take a minute to look through.
Yeah, and we do have some comments in the chat. People saying that, yeah, just general remarks about how, things that you were just saying. I do think it's very important for us to hear from people like you who may have like differing opinions on this than we do, because sometimes we're kind of encapsulated in this like tech bubble, and then it's really good for us to hear perspective like yours. So I really appreciate you telling us about all this. I think this one question is very interesting, and I'm also very curious to hear what you have to say, because I have my own thoughts and I think they kind of might be similar to yours, but I want to know. So there has been like the whole issue with big tech regarding data rights and other things in the government. And like we had the big tech hearing recently. There have been documentaries that have come out about this. Like, what are your thoughts on social media and how it affects people on the individual level, but also its recent effects in politics, and the seemingly less policy-less freedom these bigger social media companies have on user data and the usage of this data. So if you could speak on that, that would be great.
It's such a big question. Social media is so fascinating because it's become everything. Like sometimes we mean social media like, you know, Twitter, and other times we mean social media like chatting apps that have payment processing and integration with other apps and video calling, and there's just so much now. So it almost feels like it's a term we're going to very quickly outgrow. And so I think we have to really think about is the what is the platform doing, firstly, and how also is it making money? And if we're thinking of like competition issues or regulation of that kind, often that means that they're free to use, but there's advertising. And then that's where I think we mean there's privacy and user data issues that come into play. And absolutely that's critical, right? But at the same time, if we're talking about our own privacy rights, just know that that means we are coming up against an advertising lobby, right? Or like the advertising industry, which is massive. So those are the sort of two sides of it. Not to say that we can't have both, but it's probably going to be a compromise that's not great. And we've seen, Europe attempt that with the GDPR, the General Data Protection Regulation. And I think everyone would agree that it's not perfect and that it's caused some pretty annoying unintended consequences, like all the pop-ups now and things like that. I think that meaningful regulation is sorely necessary, and without it, it's causing all kinds of weird anti-patterns. So thinking about like how money flows and the major dynamic, right? So one of the things that really bothers me is that it extracts a lot of wealth. So if a social media platform, most of them are based in the United States, the really big ones, they're serving communities all over the world, right? I mean, Facebook, for example, has far more users outside the US than it has inside of it. And so it's extracting wealth out of countries that like really desperately need it, right? If you're making millions or billions of dollars off of, people living in Cameroon, right? Like how does the government feel about that extraction of wealth without any taxes paid? Because probably there's no Facebook HQ in Kinshasa, right? And so what's happening in some countries is that in an attempt to make taxes off of social media use and data flows and advertising revenue, they're starting to tax individuals. So if you buy data for your phone, you might be taxed already because you're paying like a communications tax. And then you might be taxed on top of that for the services that you use. So if you're using Facebook, then you might actually receive something additional called a social media tax. And then on top of that, you are also paying for the pleasure of being advertised to because you're paying by data. So if you download an image of an advertisement, you've just paid for that image because you paid for it with your data, right? So end users are getting really, they're the ones who are really bearing this burden of the lack of a global treaty, essentially an economic treaty, or global regulation. So it's super complicated is the answer. I think social media is an absolutely massive umbrella and there's all kinds of teeny tiny issues that need to be teased out. But I do think that the advertising and the data piece is probably the biggest because it means a lot to a lot of countries.
That was so interesting to hear. Thank you for that. So we have somebody who actually wants to come onto the stage and ask a question. Would that be all right with you?
Please.
Hi, Dylan. Feel free to unmute and ask your question.
Can you guys hear me okay?
Yep.
All right. So thank you, Mallory, for coming, first of all, and also tell your colleague who provided the honest response about quitting. Thank you as well, because I think there's a lot of truth in that statement.
I will. That's why I wanted to share it. Thanks.
In any event, here's my question. So this kind of builds on your last response about social media and kind of some of its harmful effects, but it's clear that there are a wide variety of problems with technology, ranging from dangerous algorithms to monopolization. Amazon, Facebook, Google are kind of the key players there. But Congress has been extremely slow to act, and it generally has come off as uninformed during a lot of the congressional hearings. So as someone who's sort of on the inside and works with a lot of agencies, I mean, you are in Washington, D.C. after all, do you think the government is moving closer towards actually regulating the industry, or at least trying to become more informed about the key issues in terms of technology?
So yeah, thanks for that question. I think it's a good one, and one that in various pieces of which I'm asked really often. One is like, why are governments so slow, or why don't they know anything? And I mean, I think on some level, we don't all have to be experts in things, and it's okay sometimes for elected officials to not understand. It's important that they definitely rely on staffers and institutions like CDT that are more than happy to help brief them on these issues. I think that's happening more and more. So I'm looking forward to that becoming more of a trend. But then on acting. So one of the things that needs to happen in the US that's happened in many, many, many other countries, but not yet in the US, is privacy legislation. So that's something that CDT works on. We have a whole program around it. We have legislation that is ready to go. We have several people on our privacy and data team that at any time would be happy to help Congress and the Senate and everybody pass, this legislation. So that is probably the first step. And I think that it does appear that that's a bit of a regulatory step, because, you first need to protect user privacy first and foremost. And then there may be other things or fallout effects from that need to be regulated as well, right? Like I mentioned, the tax issue. There's other things that both Europe and some of the other more democratic and developed world countries have started to deal with, for better or worse, right? I mean, we've got also countries that are trying to, break into encryption. And, so the emboldenedness of governments to really control the internet is a double-edged sword. We are seeing an increased appetite for, regulating what apps people can have on their phones here, which is just not the right move. So it needs to be a balance. But I think we can start with the really low-hanging fruit, which is just the US needs data privacy regulation done. That's the first step.
Thank you so much. Yeah, Dylan, if you have any other remarks.
Oh, no, thank you so much. That was great.
Thanks, Dylan.
Awesome, thank you. So we have a question in the chat that I kind of want to cover before we go into anything more complicated. So somebody's asking, and they're saying it might be a dumb question, but I just want to let you guys know there are no dumb questions, so feel free to ask. What is activism, and what does it mean to be an activist? And this kind of coincides with something I wanted to ask earlier, but like, what is a career in social justice and technology like?
Yeah, so I think being an activist is even more of a broad term, than being like a public interest technologist. It means so many different things to different people. I think it's just the general feeling that things need to change and in a particular direction, right? Whatever that is, and then feeling that it's one's, duty to really participate as best they can. Like that's sort of like the sentiment I've always felt, which has sort of led me down this career. It's like it really is like a feeling that's motivated. Either it's because of witnessing injustice that's incredibly motivating, or experiencing that injustice. Many people in our country have their whole lives, and it's also fine to not also, like, you can do other things, and you can even be a public interest technologist without feeling like you're an activist. It's only one shade or one flavor, right? It's not the end all be all. But I think it's just an interest in, in being active and trying to solve current day issues. And I think it's also the two other components I'd highlight is the analysis. So having like a consistent political analysis is often part and parcel of being an activist. So, and consistent, I think, is the operative word. We're inundated with a lot of different views daily. There's a lot of different, polarizing discussion and discourse in this country. That's not all great. I think what's important is really just to be able to look at a situation and be able to fit it into a consistent worldview. that you're actively cultivating through reading, through following thought leaders, through following movement leaders in particular. And then I think that another one is community. So when I look back and I think of myself as an activist, I almost always start thinking of people and faces from my past and my present who inspire me. A community of practice as a technologist is one, but also an activist as part of a movement is another. And people who inspire you and who are your friends and your colleagues who've, met your kids and, come to your parents' funeral or whatever it is, like they're there. And I think that that's a really core element of what I've experienced as an activist. Not to say that we shouldn't have boundaries between the things that we work on and are passionate about and, where our work starts and our life stops. But it's different for everyone. So I wouldn't necessarily say that these experiences of mine as an activist are the way it is, but that's just speaking from myself.
Thank you. And you touched on especially within your community, and I think that's super important. And I know a lot of us here are from the CS at Illinois community. So I really want to stress even within our community at our school, there's so many ways for us to speak out and be activists. And I know Mallory definitely encourages all of us to do so. But yeah, are there any other people who would like to ask their own questions and come on the stage? If not, we can do more questions from the submitted ones. Yeah, how would you encourage an undergraduate student to work towards pursuing a field similar to yours, whether it be through courses, internships, or volunteering in general?
Yeah, so I would say, so on courses, one of the things that changed the course of my life was a class in my undergraduate year that had me volunteer at a homeless shelter. So I mentioned before that I had always been active, and I had been, but I wanted to have a philosophy minor, which I didn't end up getting, but I took a religion class, and I'm not actually a religious person, but it just, because there was this sort of praxis, this idea that you learned and you read and then you did, that was a really interesting introduction to that. And that then as part of the course, we volunteered, and I chose to volunteer in a homeless shelter. So I took physics and math classes, but that course changed the way that I approached all of the other work that I did and the kind of person that I became. So maybe if you have the opportunity, just take something that's out of your, that's out of the normal path. You might fall in love with it. It might give you a new perspective. I've also heard this about humanities people that took a statistics course, right? So it goes both ways, and you shouldn't be afraid to take that advice any way you want. I would probably take modern dance if I could do it over again. Then I think on internships or volunteering, I think those are great ways. I know a lot of organizations, CDT and others like it, have opportunities for interns, have opportunities for volunteers. And it's a great way to test it out. It's not going to be you're not going to get a full experience, but at least you're going to start building a network of people. You're going to be able to I've had a lot of virtual coffees, right? To get to know people that you want to maybe be like or are inspired by, as a way to just test the waters and ask a bunch of questions. So thumbs up to that. And again, think big, think wide. Maybe if, the place the ACLU isn't taking any more interns, there's plenty of organizations also around the world. Again, one of the most formative experiences of my life professionally was working for an NGO based in South Africa. It changed the whole way I think about everything. So, don't box yourself in, and you'll find and discover a lot. There's a lot out there.
Thank you so much. And I know we are nearing 8 p.m., but this is our last talk of the day. So if you have time, Mallory, we're totally happy to go over. Yeah, it's all up to you. But this is kind of a little bit of a selfish question based on what you just asked. But, we're all aware of the very big nonprofits, I guess, that we can go work for, volunteer for, or intern for. Maybe if you can give us some advice on how you found the organization you got involved with, or we can go out searching for these, because like the most advertised internships are going to be the ones at like Facebook, Google, Amazon, those kinds of companies. How can we, do you have any tips for getting involved in the smaller nonprofits?
I mean, if I can be completely honest, you've got like wherever it is you're living, like maybe you're living in Illinois for school, maybe you go back somewhere else during the summertime. There are organizations on your block, more than likely, right? There's a food co-op over there. There's like a bookstore over there. There might be, you know, at the community center, people meeting for yoga class, or, you know, they're getting ready to do some rallies over, you know, Pride Month or Black Lives Matter, whatever it is. Like, you could be used there. That is absolutely how I started out. Like I said, that I can talk about that, right? The New Jersey Four. So I sort of glossed over that when I was giving you Rollo's take on this whole thing. But, you know, I was volunteering at a bookstore that then turned into essentially a part-time job because I became a worker owner. And somebody came in one night. It was like, you guys, the most terrible thing happened. Like 5 women from New Jersey were just arrested in the West Village because they like beat up a guy. Anyway, and it was this whole thing, and it turned out they all ended up with prison sentences. And it was, and they, not only that, it was like a gang charge, you know, so this is like a group of, you know, lesbian women who are friends, right? And they got hit with an enhanced sentence because they were considered a gang, which is just bogus, right? So we sort of worked together. This is back in 2006 to just raise awareness about this, raise money for it. There's now a film, you can watch the film about the New Jersey Four, and that's the sort of thing that I got involved in. So that is not like a big NGO. That's like, this thing needs doing, this injustice needs correcting. I'm gonna build a website over the weekend, because it took a weekend back then. And then maybe we can start this campaign and get other people on board, and follow, you know, this case as it goes. So it went for years, right? Because as you know, court cases do. So I would just say, like, there's so many different ways to get involved, and everything, all of those experiences will teach you something. And I think that the more you learn and the more you are in dialogue, again, as a bridge between people that are part of affected communities and yourself as an expert, the more you can just continue to replicate that and do that more. And you'll be better at it the more sort of surface area you have with affected communities. I don't think necessarily that like working for big NGOs gets you that experience. So, you know, consider that in your calculus as well. You know, depending on what it is exactly that you want to do.
Mm-hmm. That's a really interesting insight. I like that. So please continue to send your questions. We definitely want to hear them. And if you want to ask one, raise your hand. There's kind of it might be a bit of a complicated question in the chat, but is there a specific breakdown of value derived per customer per country by social media companies? It would seem that the most value is derived from the areas with the highest expendable income, since the most common action advertising wants to accomplish is to buy something. So what are your thoughts on this?
Yeah, I mean, I think these are really interesting questions, right? I actually, I don't know much about economics, but I read a couple years ago, The Value of Everything, highly recommend, Maria Mazzucato, and she talks about how these figures are derived, right? I think even sometimes when big tech companies are estimating revenues and things like that, it's not always super precise. And so you can imagine how, you know, maybe a government, like a nation state elsewhere, has to sort of figure out, you know, where the value is going. And, you know, what's coming in, what's coming out. Like, it's not an exact science. And I think there are a lot of ways to come up with the figure. Sometimes it isn't just about buying a good and having it delivered the next day. Like, we know that lots of political candidates are buying ads. Lots of people buy ad space, not just on social media, but billboards and elsewhere for things that we wouldn't consider goods, right? So I think that we also need to remember that the purpose of advertising isn't always so straightforward. and yeah, calculating that value is not straightforward either. That's one of the reasons why having, you know, global treaties around this would be really helpful. I do worry sometimes when I do dip in to the World Trade Organization talks about, you know, global taxation of digital goods. I do feel a little worried that like a lot of things are considered part of that deal, that a lot of different things are being sort of parceled out and negotiated, put on the table and then taken away as bargaining chips. That really worries me a lot. I don't want everything to be dictated in terms of economics, because we lose a lot as people who are just trying to use the internet, right? But yeah, but I think it's an important one that we can't ignore it, right? Like the US can't continue to sort of put its head in the sand about these issues that are really affecting like a lot of countries and a lot of the value as it moves globally.
Yeah, thank you so much. So for people who I guess are entering the workforce now or about to enter the workforce, and a lot of these people may be going into tech companies, how can we get more of the people we work with, or just like CEOs, students, companies in general, to care more about public interest technology, or about these like ethical questions in general?
Well, it depends on the ethical issue, right? I think some are more palatable than others. You know, in the US, there is a lot of concern for individual privacy. In other countries, that is not the same concern. Maybe the concern is censorship. Some communities really feel, or, you know, activists or just general population feels very strongly about having an uncensored internet. Another one that I've seen in, you know, various communities, they're worried about security, like cybersecurity. So if you have, you know, mobile banking, you know, all kinds of other sorts of integrations, people get hacked a lot, right? So there's different values in different places. I think finding that is actually really critical. So I don't think there's actually like a blanket answer to your question. It depends on what you're working on, and more importantly, where, which will then dictate to whom. Like, who do you have in mind when you think about the public? So if you're advocating on behalf of the public interest, who's your public? Are you in dialogue with them? Do they know what you're doing and what you're talking about? And are you actually an advocate for them, or are you doing something else? So those are really important questions to ask yourself. And like I said, sometimes you need to be able to talk about the importance of privacy, and other times you need to turn that dialogue off, and you need to then shift into talking about censorship, circumvention, or, you know, end user cybersecurity, or whatever it is, right? But I do think that part of being a public interest technologist is having that situational awareness, so that you can actually be the best advocate you can be for your target audience.
Yeah, I think that makes a lot of sense. Sorry, I want to let Melissa do a quick announcement before we go into any remaining questions. Yeah, Melissa, take it away.
Sure, thank you. And also thank you to Mallory and Shogun for doing this wonderful fireside. So just this one really quick announcement for everybody here. So I have put an attendance form and a code in the chat. If you fill out the attendance form, you will be entered in a drawing for one of 5 $20 Grubhub gift cards. So as thank you for coming to this talk, dinner is on us. So if you missed a free food at RP, miss it no longer. I'll be leaving this form open for about 5 more minutes as we wrap up the talk. So I'm going to hand it back to Shogun now to ask the last question in the Q&A.
Thank you. Yeah, so to just wrap this up, you touched on this earlier a bit, but if you could go maybe a bit more in depth, what does your day-to-day work look like?
Yeah. Well, maybe should I tell you about my day today? So yeah, some of it is calls. So sometimes it's about just being available to either strategize with my colleagues around something that just came out in the news, and we need to get on the same page about a position that is both informed legally and with some technical expertise, right? So, you know, the news over the weekend, right, about like TikTok and WeChat, we needed to huddle up about that. Other times it's about being available externally. So if I'm doing coalition building, we have CDT is part of a coalition on global encryption. So we're trying to make sure that the various governments currently trying to disrupt end-to-end encryption for, lawful access or et cetera, are met with resistance by a global coalition. Like we'll need to have calls from time to time. So I had one of those today. We needed to hear and understand the current proposed laws in Germany that are coming up around that. And then also there was a quote unquote technical paper published under the auspices of the European Council that came out. It was leaked actually through Politico last week or the week before that we needed to respond to. So technical experts had a huddle. What are we going to do about this stuff? And then let's see, what else did I, oh, right. So another coalition that I even forgot to talk about, which is a pity, is in an attempt to field build a bit around public interest technologists. I'm also co-chair of more of an informal group that meets, these are people that are involved in a variety of standards organizations around the world. Everything from like 3GPP to ITU, W3C, IETF, et cetera. We try to meet once a month just to share the good, the bad, and the ugly. Mostly it's the bad and ugly. And sometimes it's just the ugly of various proposals that we see that are concerning to us, that we need reviews on, or that we don't understand and we need somebody else to like repeat back to us what we heard and help us like break this out so that we, we feel like there are other eyes on it. Because, a lot of us that I can think of that I would regard as my public interest technologist peers, we're like standalones in our organization. I'm not, because I have a team. So I have Hannah K. DeLevely and Will Adler, who are on my team here at CDT. But for some of us, we're it, right? We're the one person in the organization that has technical expertise. So we need a group, like we need to convene sometimes, and we need to have eyes in different places. So those are like the kinds of calls that I'll do on any given day. And then, yeah, there's a lot of sort of email, the similar kind of thing, right? But like following the various conversations that are going on in terms of standard setting or policy development processes, and then reading all the background material that I need to understand what's being proposed and what position we might want to take. And yeah, and then, a lot of us are managers, right? Because we're hiring more junior people. We're hiring people to, essentially put in the pipeline, right? We're trying to build this field so that we're not just alone, but then that means we have to spend a lot of time as managers, which I personally love. I love being a manager. I love, working with diverse teams and really transforming the space. And yeah, kind of building community through that as well. So all those things are not negligible, and they amount to very full, sometimes more than 8 hours a day. But yeah, I have good work-life balance. I do think that is another part of being a good manager, is being able to turn it off at the end of the day.
Definitely. Well, I want to say thank you so much for coming today. I really appreciate it. And I think this talk was so helpful and so informative and just very interesting in general. So thank you for taking your time to do this. And
Shagun, it's been so nice working on this with you and getting to know you. And you just always have these like really excellent questions that get right to the heart of everything. So thanks so much for doing Fireside with me.
Yeah, I really enjoyed it. With that, I would like to let everyone go if you need to go, but thank you so much to everybody for coming here. And if you want to interact with Mallory after this, she will be in the Discord. We have some people in the chat saying thank you. Yeah, she will be in the Discord. Mallory, will you be here immediately after this, or did you say tomorrow you would be?
I'm going to hang out for just about 5 or 10 minutes. I'm going to get going, but then I will be around on Discord tomorrow midday. So You'll see me there as well.
Okay, sounds good. So what I can do is you can shoot me a message that you're going online, and then I can make an announcement to everybody saying that you'll be online, so people will know then.
Great.
Yeah, sounds good. Well, thank you so much, everybody. This has been really great.
Thanks so much. Have a good evening. Have a good rest of your conference.